If you load in scene landscape C17 EcoPop, you can see the scene I have loaded in right now, which is basically the ecosystem population I'm going to end up with. I have made a few changes, basically adjusting the scale of the overall ecosystem. If we take a look at landscape zone 1, which is now also an entirely different shape, and I have disconnected the eco zones connected to the spheres. At the moment, EcoPop layer 4 and 3 are unused. I think in this case I have enough control from the first and second layers to really get the population that I want. At least that I can see at the moment for the zone I have set up. If I decide to use them later, I'm going to keep them in the material so that I can come back and use them. If we take a look at the scaling of our first layer, our overall scaling I've changed to 0.6. And I have greatly increased the size of the ecosystem. Just for the sake of this scene and the training, just to be able to see it a little bit better and be able to see a little bit more of the landscape and the ecosystem along with that detail. I think the scales kind of go together a little bit better. I've reduced the scale on most of the instances down to 0.5, 0.6 minimum, and some of them even lower. And I also haven't loaded in every single object that I created a variation for. If we take a look at the second layer, and I also have two new layers, and I'll be going over those in just a second. Those are the affin layers for the affinity with layer. So I've added a few more to the population for the second, and our variable density is still set up the same, environment still the same. I have made a few changes, and what I have is the maximum size variation has been increased to 1.4, and under keep proportions I've set it to more of a non-uniform value, which is going to start to take advantage of these size variations. Instead of using the up axis only for rotation, I'm using all axes. That way, what will happen is our trees will get rotated around on not just the z-axis or the up axis, but on every axis. And you can get some really interesting looking trees that way. As you can see, a lot of the conifers are going side to side, and I just think it looks a little bit better that way. You can, of course, change it to whatever you want. What I have done for a little bit of a better coloration is turned on color at low densities and just using the default color, I've increased the radius and the influence. And you'll be able to see that around the edges of the ecosystem layer and kind of spreading out around it. And I've done that for both EcoPop 1 and 2. Now, if we take a look at the layers I've created above number 1 and number 2, these are taking advantage of the population for the layer just underneath them, so 1 and 2. What the affinity with layer option does is it'll populate basically in the exact place of the layer underneath it, without having to go into the density and set a variable density. In some cases, when you're using the distribution random set by a function, as we are with layer 1 and 2, what can happen is you can go outside the ranges of 1 with the fractal you're creating and -1, and sometimes it might only show a couple of the plants in the scene because maybe the values are too high or too low. Or maybe it looks good, but you want to have a few sparser plants along in there. So what I've done is added the gnarl 1 variation and the bush crawl 1 variation to act with affinity with layer. just above layer 1. And I have the environment tab set basically to the defaults, where we have a full altitude range, full slope range, because what we want to use to control this is just the layer underneath it and that density. So if you want to see what this looks like, I'm going to go ahead and clear this out. Now you can see a lot of that green has disappeared from the ecosystem. I'm going to go ahead and repopulate this just so you can see what it's done. You can tell it populated, and this section we see down here is layer 2, which is why nothing really showed up there. But in our layer 1 patch that we can see, we have a nice distribution of these 2 new plants. So they're pretty sparse, density set to 37, but they're only showing up really within the population and the density from the layer underneath. And this works with dynamic population too, so you don't need to worry about populating it first with the standard population. When View calculates dynamic population, it will take that into account, moving from the lower layers and working its way up in case you are using those settings. If you decide you want some sparse plants in these in-between areas where there currently is no vegetation, then you could use the repulsion from layer. And let's just go ahead and do that now with this setup, and I can go ahead and change this back if I want to. I'm going to set our affinity layer to at least 0. I'm going a little negative. And I'm going to turn up the repulsion and go ahead and click populate. And now what we can see is the areas that don't have population now have these trees inside of them. I can also see that my bush is maybe a little bit too small, some of the smaller dots showing up within that population. So this is also a good way to judge scale by separating from your current population. And now with that increased scale, it looks a little better. So you can separate these objects from the current population. And if we wanted to just have some really sparse trees, we turn down the density, and now we can have some trees outside of the current population and just nicely spread out throughout the scene. So just by using these 2 layers, layer 1 and 2 that we've already set up, we can create a bunch of layers on top of it, new ecosystem layers, in order to repulse or come closer to the current population, and use those 2 to control the entire ecosystem set of layers if we wanted to, just because there's so many variations that can be created from them. Another really cool thing we can do with this is if we do decide to use layer 3 and 4, which are set up, we can set those to be affinity with layer or repulsion from layer, and basically have them populate closer to the layers below, but still have an overall coverage since they do cover a large majority of the scene. So I'm going to change Eco1 Fin back to kind of where it was before, where we have it mixing along with the layer 1 population. Just because I like the variation it adds to it, some larger plants within the area, increase our density to a little over 30%. And one of the easiest ways to add a new ecosystem layer is just to select the last material layer, which in this case is our sand underwater, and click Ecosystem. Now it's going to create a duplicate layer called the same thing as the one below it, which is sand underwater, but this is now an ecosystem layer. So instead of having to go to add layer and cancel and then delete the layer that's created, this way can be a little bit easier, and it will retain the settings from the previous layer, just like we created them before. If you're going to be using repulsion or affinity with layer, then you can use the altitude range, slope range, or even use those with those settings in order to really get a lot of control out of the ecosystem. So there's a lot you can do with it. I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer since I'm not going to be using it. And let's take a look at transferring this over to our final scene that we're going to be using to render everything out. And I'm going to go ahead and just save this just where it's at right now. And we could use this scene to build off of for the final. Since we still have our terrain population, there's no standard terrain in here because we did remove it in a previous version. We can always bring that back if we want. But really, it's just going to be as easy as removing our zone objects from the scene, or at least disconnecting them if we want to bring them back a little later. Since we have so many versions of the scene, and the setups for them can be easily created with the meta nodes we made, I think the simplest thing is really just going to be removing those from the scene. So now we need to get this ready to transfer to the dynamic population so that we're ready to render out and decide if we want to go a little bit closer, maybe add some more materials, make modifications to the current material. We could use the population settings and the density control we're using to populate the ecosystem layers, and use those to add materials if we wanted to. Maybe if we thought we needed some dead leaves underneath the forest areas, we could use those populations in order to control the alpha of a leaf-looking surface, and that's pretty straightforward. We're not going to be going too far in depth with anything more with this scene, because I think I'd really just be repeating myself after this point. The amount of detail you want to add is really entirely up to you with the extent of the scene you're working on. I think I've gone over some really good techniques in order for you to define different zones and populations and really decide how much detail you need without having to horribly manipulate your scene or spend too much time tweaking. So now let's get ready to set this up. First, what I'm going to do is save this. We're going to go up and we're going to create our D group. And we can call this final. So I'll call this landscape D 01. And if you want to incorporate the texture maps and compress the file, you can do that as well. I'm going to keep these options just turned off. So I'm going to show you how I disconnected the zone controls. If we edit the material, and let's go into EcoPop 1, the density, edit the function, and I had actually had the control for the ecozone still within the function, but because it wasn't connected to anything, it did remove it from the material. And I'm going to go ahead and check layer 2, and it looks like it's done the same. And I'm just going to check and make sure it didn't get moved off to the side, and it looks like it's just gone completely. Basically what I did was just delete the link from the Blender and reconnect it to the population, assuming of course that it would retain within the material and the density so that I could come back to it later. But of course that was an easy setup and we created a meta node for it, so I can always reconnect those. Basically what we want to do now is go through anything we have populated and clear it. So since we are just working with the 4 ecosystem layers, that's all we need to clear out. what I'm going to do is delete the eco zones, unless of course you wanted to keep them to refine some of the areas within the scene, but I'm not going to be using them anymore. And now we need to disconnect the zone control for the landscape. Now you could keep this connected if you wanted to, since it doesn't render. You could just manipulate the size of the zone control back to the original shape we had of the landscape. If we switch to our camera group B, we can see the position we had before for the full landscape. So it could really just be as simple as changing the scale of this. But what I want to do is just remove any sort of graph connection. Not that I've ever run into any problems with it, but I think that the simpler the scene is going to be, the less likely it is we are going to run into problems. So I am going to remove the control. I'm not just going to delete the zone first. I want to go into the graph of the landscape. And what I want to do is delete the connections to the node. And basically from our constraint we created before to the output. Delete those links first, and then delete the overall nodes. And now we have a complete disconnection. We can delete the Zone 1 control and retain the shape of our terrain. We can go back to our scale and now increase it. And I'm going to make it, and let's go ahead and make it 2 kilometers on the X and 2 kilometers on the Y. If you need to make it a little larger, you can. I'm going to deselect this for the moment, and as we can see, the terrain has not updated. So I'm going to edit the object, let that refresh. We can click OK, and then that will show up in our scene. And I'm going to go back to the main camera and just set up our scene, deselect everything, and I only want to really have the landscape as large as I need it. We can also reposition it. So we'll select the landscape, and I'm just going to move it over. And if it hasn't refreshed, you can edit the object and then just close out the terrain editor. Remembering that we are using a lower pixel value in order to allow the refresh within the editor be much quicker. And now we only need to worry about the refresh within the OpenGL. So now we have this showing up in the scene. And now we need to go back to our landscape material. You can choose to give it a new name if you want. I am going to remove the zone and just the zone portion of the name. I'm going to turn back on our water, removing that from hidden, so now it'll show up in the scene. And I did have the layer turned off as well, so I'll turn that back on. We can go back into the landscape. You could save this out if you wanted, but first I want to get it ready for the population. And it's really as simple as turning on dynamic population. Go to all of our layers, turn on dynamic pop, and what that's done is turn them on for all of our layers. If you did have anything that was populated with the populate command, all of those instances will be cleared. Because basically once you're using dynamic population for a specific material, all the layers themselves will react the same way. So now we're set up for our dynamic population, and I'm going to render out a frame, and we can take a look at how our scene looks. What you can also do if you want to make sure you have a separate copy of everything, right mouse click on the landscape material and save the material out. And that way you could load that into maybe another version of the scene, or just to have it saved just in case something happens to your primary scene. I'm also going to make sure I just save the scene we're working in right now. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out.